everyone. In these days, we remember the 10th anniversary of a series of events that changed partially or even completely the shape of most of the countries in North Africa, Middle East, and also had a huge impact on a lot of phenomena and trends that we are looking at in the past years, especially in the European area and its major countries, but also some effects they have on major countries connected to it, like Russia, United States, and also very famous events like the rise and the birth, especially of ISIS, and the strong immigration that we are seeing lately towards the European community are somehow connected to these events during the years and during the evolution of these ones. And these events are usually summarized in the huge umbrella that is called the Arab Spring. And today I want to speak about its main causes, or at least the ones that are shared among the majority of the countries, before going more into details, and explain why I think understanding events like the Arab Spring can help us in interpreting in a better way, in maybe in a more easy way, something that happened in the past or what is happening in the present, in order to have a little bit better understanding and less confusion whenever we read newspapers or watch the media and we want to make our own opinion. So how did the Arab Spring start actually? According to all media, everything started on December 17th, 2010 in Tunisia, where a young Tunisian who was selling vegetables set himself afire to protest against the police harassment. Specifically, they stole his cart that he was using to sell vegetables and sustain his family. Mohamed Bouazizi died on January 4th, 2011, but not before his justice work.
The symbol, by just burning himself, using his body as a way to express that anger and need for dignity, touched a lot of Tunisians.
Sparkling protest against the cost of living and the country's authoritarian president Zine El Abidine Ben Ali. Ben Ali's 23-year rule ended just 10 days later when he fled to Saudi Arabia to escape from the protest, becoming the first leader of an Arab nation to be pushed out by his popular protest, apparently. And this is just the beginning, because it was a matter of a couple of weeks, maybe, when people saw that actually a change was possible, that even other countries started to set on fire, literally and metaphorically.
I think, like the majority of the Tunisian people, we were in disbelief.
One of the first one, the biggest country in Africa, was Egypt. On January 25th, 2011, thousands of Egyptians marched in Cairo, Alexandria, and the major cities demanding the departure of President Hosni Mubarak, who had been in power for over 30 years back then. And on February 11, as more than 1 million took to the streets, according to the major media, and Mubarak resigned and handed control to the military. In that moment, one of the biggest opposition party was the Muslim Brotherhood linked parties that started the government with the lead of Mohamed Morsi, who was elected in 2012, but was overthrown a little bit later, the following year, by the military, led by the general Abdel El-Sisi, who is still now in power and in charge in Egypt. Morsi was later imprisoned for having caused death of protestants against his government, and I would say it's legit to say that this was a sentence who was basically a political show-off of power to show that you cannot mess up with the main government. And Morsi recently died in prison. Then we turn back to Libya, so still in North Africa, in which we see, together with Syria and Yemen, one of the unfortunately worst scenarios. In the same day the protest in Bahrain started, the Libyan police used force to break up a sit-in against the government in the second major city in Libya, Benghazi. The country's leader Mohamed Gaddafi pledged to hunt down the so-called rats opposing him. The uprising turned into a civil war between the different tribes that were living and trying to rule in Libya. And also in that back then, the French, British and American air forces actually took a stand against Gaddafi, fighting close to the rebel. And in October 20th, 2011, so just roughly 1 year after not even 1 year after the first turmoils, Gaddafi was captured and killed in Sirte. If you read the news now, you will see that Libya now is still, unfortunately, in a civil war scenario, and the situation got even worse in the next years. Another country that unfortunately saw a really bad scenario was Syria, and just a couple of months after Tunisia, on March 6, a dozen teenagers attacked the wall of their school in southern Syria with the writing "Your turn, doctor," referring to Bashar al-Assad. After these first riots, the government started a violent repression against the revolts, and that turned into a civil war. And I think that even if we look at just these two countries, the last that we followed, so Syria and Libya, and we compare to Tunisia and Egypt, we notice how spread and how diverse was the outcome. And I think this makes everything more not only necessary to be understood, but also interesting, because how is it possible that for the same reason, during the same time, we saw such different outcomes? There were also other cases, and we can say that the worst one was Yemen, in which unfortunately we still see something that the UN considered one of maybe the worst genocide of this century, which is not even a war anymore. And the situation goes on. This is just a sparkle, this is just the beginning, but as you see, there are many different scenarios within the same event, the same phenomenon. So now that we talk about how the Arab Spring started, so what was the sparkle and why did it actually spread in, how did it spread in most of the countries, we want to actually go into the detail of how it evolved through each country, because it would be really too long discussion, and this is not the point actually. What I really would like to focus on are the main causes, or what the most of the researches that I could find and most of the experts on the topic said they should be considered as the main causes of most of the uprising in the countries that have been touched. This is maybe not valid for each country in the same way, but these have been, let's say, the most common causes among each country, because all these countries have somehow similar features and characteristics that make them homogeneous and also possible to be compared. Again, the focus on the causes is not just because it's itself the Arab Spring, but because focus on causes, it's always helpful whenever we want to understand how an event developed, why did it start, what is going on, who are the factors that are involved, who are the major agents who are involved into this, and also if you want to somehow predict what is going on, it's always useful to have some benchmarks and at the same time understanding why something is happening. And there are some criteria I think that are always useful, and I think the Arab Spring is an example for it, to understand how this actually possible event X unknown, started, developed, and there are some figures that we could also check meanwhile to understand if we are getting the right point or not, and also to understand whether the media are giving us a complete perspective, a complete picture, or maybe is lacking. Whenever we look at the causes for the Arab Spring specifically, I think we notice some patterns that can be useful also to debug and understand other major events, other major possible uprising turmoils, but in general, also whenever we watch any news or post or whatever, it can be also useful to understand them in our daily life, in our present. And if you look at them, so if you look at the specific causes for the Arab Spring, the first cause that we can find, which sounds a little bit weird because, it was somehow different in different scope, it happened kind of far away, was actually the 2008 financial crisis. And you might think, wait, how are they connected? We're not talking about stocks failing or something. No, we're not talking about that. But we actually saw I mean, according to many research, is that one of the reasons why most of the population in these countries were starting this uprising and they were suffering of a bad economical condition were because of an chain effect generated by the financial crisis. Specifically, after the crisis, most of the investors decided to invest on commodities, for example, gold or simply corn, and that commodities that almost never lose values because the economy needs them, like for example corn, crops and so on, that are sold on the stocks. And what happened is that this huge series of consecutive purchase increased drastically the price of these commodities. And you can imagine, if you look at the charts, in just a couple of weeks the prices started to increase drastically, and in 2008, 2009 the prices almost tripled. So from an average of $4, for example, they become $12 per ton. So you can imagine that from one day to another, the bread that you're buying or the first commodities that you need to live are increasing prices day by day. And if you live in a rich country, that's maybe easy. I mean, you can still afford it. Like for example in the Saudi Arabia case or the Emirates case, with an income which is comparable to the United States, you can still say it's fine. But whenever your income or your average income is 10 times lower, how do you do it? How do you afford it? And that's why the situation was putting a lot of pressure on the economical system of these countries that was already shaking, and the governments back then were not able to cope with this changing. And this is something that is also interesting to see, because it might happen again, and in many cases recently we see that this changing in prices are still happening again. So this is the first one, and I think the lesson for this is look at some specific markets index can always be interesting, even if you're maybe not on the topic, you're not that familiar. It might be useful to see not just the classical stocks, but also these kind of commodities that could be useful to understand what is going on and if something is happening again. The second one was corruption. If you look at the corruption index shared by most of the organization, we see that all the countries that were touched by the Arab Spring turmoils and uprising were ranked actually very low into these rankings since 2010, 2011, 2012, when these events occurred. And I think it's even more interesting to notice how the different scenarios and the different outcomes were also somehow aligned with the rankings of this corruption index compared to the other countries. So the countries like Tunisia or Saudi Arabia, who ranked better in terms of corruption index, had also a smoother transition towards a more stable government, a change in the institutions that were involved in order to secure a better transition, while the others which were already in a worsened condition had worse outcomes and scenarios. And why corruption is so important is because corruption itself is creating a lot of chain effects and damages to the economy and the society that might not be easy to notice, but they are creating damage and effects. For example, lost opportunities, lost investment opportunity, higher inequality, a lot of fake taxes, which was somehow the reason why Bosizin the first time had to do that extreme action. And it was because of the corruption that was also in Tunisia back then. And all this situation given by higher level of corruption at the end create higher damages on the society that put a pressure on a lot of indicators, especially the economic indicators, the inequality indicators, that if not recovered by a better growth or a higher stability, is unlikely to be solved by itself. And this is one part also of the story that was immediately portrayed by the biggest media. The other one, which is almost a side of corruption, was the inequality, especially the inequality on two levels: the present, so the economic inequalities, but also the perspectives. Something that complained, and in some researches came out, is that the young generation, so the population of the countries that went from 25 years old, even up to 45 years old, so the ones who should have seen a better expectancy of life and a better outcome from their work in the latest years, they were expecting a growth in their countries, their own countries. They didn't see it getting better. They didn't see any further change towards a better condition for them and for their children. So at some point, if you include also the economic pressure and the reduced capability of living in a comparable level of wealth, if you could say so, made this turmoil coming out more easily, or at least it eased the sparkle. It was able to spread the sparkle, especially in one country after the other. And especially in some researches, you can see that these problems were shared not just by the youngest generation, but it was shared also by the boomer, so the 50s and 60s born generation. The other point, I think, is related mostly to the money. And for these countries especially, there's one resource that is generating a lot of money and also issues, which is oil. Actually, oil and gas, but specifically, we can say oil, because back then it was the biggest focus. So most of these countries had had signed huge and long-term agreements with the most important oil companies like Chevron, BP, Eni. You can actually mention most of them. And most of the countries set up huge investments thanks to the investment brought by these agreements. The problem is that most of the cases the outcome for the countries were actually getting not so much benefit from it. So in many cases the main incomes, so the returns of this investment, were mostly blocked into country-owned institutional country-owned companies that were held also by the families in charge or in government, and that basically creating a loop of corruption and a chain effect that actually didn't provide further development for the whole society. And this was one of the explanations of the inequalities perception. The fact that the families in charge, the family in the government, had a lot of benefits from it, but at the end, the people who should have benefited the most didn't see anything, didn't see these effects. For example, in Tunisia, a problem was that a lot of people were getting better education, were getting a better comparable secondary and primary education, but this actually was not enough to find a job. There were not enough jobs for these people, for the youngest generation, to find a better job and to actually start having a better development compared, for example, to the parents. And this at some point creating a stretch and a pressure on the system, especially the social system. I think from this point is, especially in these years, what the Arab Spring teaches us is that the resources, mainly oil, gas, or other resources, for example, for the electronic industry, are more and more vitally important. And there are just a few key players that are trying to get more and more of this. So whenever we see some changing governments or weird decisions or maybe also strange situation going on, I think it's fine, I think it's legit if we ask ourselves, is it maybe because they have some special resources that another country want to get? Especially if you look, for example, at China in Africa, what is going on is because of the resource. And always look for where is the money flowing, from whom to whom, and how is it working. I think if we get that, it's always a good hint. In this case, it was a good hint to understand the relationship between the governments and the people, and how and why in the further development other countries actually decided to act in support, sometimes or also against some governments or population. For example, France, United States, as we saw for Libya, and even Saudi Arabia in the case of Yemen. So that said, we saw the beginning of the Arab Spring, how it started. We saw the main causes, and we also saw how they are somehow merged with each other, and also what could be useful for us to be used as a benchmark, as a let's say pattern to follow whenever we look at other events and we want to make yourself an opinion or understand a little bit better what's going on. That said, why I actually started this video thinking that Arab Spring could be useful for me, for you, for us to be used as a benchmark or as a parameter for other events. I think for at least 4 points. The major are, first of all, we saw the need of understanding the causes first. So I think understanding the causes is the first point. Whenever you understand why something is going on, you can actually make yourself an idea. Much better than just saying, oh, it happened, good to know. The second one is an inquiry of the media. Especially in the Arab Spring, I'm going to link in the description also, I'm going to leave this link that it clarifies a little bit more some researches. There have been many comparisons between the different media coverage, especially from BBC, CNN, Al Jazeera, and other important labels, in which they showed how most of them were representing an uneven and not complete picture of what was going on. It was mostly polarized to show that the governments played the bad guy role, which is, as we saw, actually a proved statement, but that was not a complete statement. It was not a fair figure in many cases, and they didn't focus on why specific parties or why specific sides of the population were actually standing with the government and why not. So inquiring a little bit more on the media to detach from the first representation that is given, it's, I think, always useful. Remembering that most of the times what we look at, for example, at events in our country or in other countries, is given by different media entity, different companies that might be from the same country or from different countries. Comparing medias and sources from different countries on the same topic, I think it's always very useful because it shows different perspective, and at some point, picking a mix of them, we can get a better idea, a little bit more clean maybe. The other reason is trying to reason on the more meaningful and trustworthy news. Some news are not trustworthy, and we notice that they're basically saying nothing useful. And especially for in these cases is looking at, I think that's the other point, maybe more figures than just reports or just the tale of what is going on. So instead of just looking at what is happening, trying to also compare it with a theory, or at least with some assumption, to understand if what they're saying can make sense. And you can use economical indexes, or you can look for some explanation by expert that can explain better how to use some figures, like in specific indexes or specific basic economical indexes. They might be complicated at first, but when you look at them and when you listen to some experts explaining them, it might be easier to understand what they mean and how can they be used. So this is it. This is the Arab Spring and its main causes and why I think it's important. Let me know what you think about it, and if you like the video, subscribe to the channel, leave a like, leave a comment, just let me know what you think, and if you think that something is missing, or if you actually think that something was wrong and actually I got it wrong, and we can make a better interpretation and get better lessons from it. So see you next time. Goodbye.